In this tutorial we're going to look at how we can use our knowledge that we've built up so far to actually begin to start to solve some programming problems. And this is perhaps the hardest thing in programming. So what we've got here is a problem specification, and all I've done is in Python I've used comments, which is this sharp symbol here, this hash symbol here. Python simply ignores this code here. This is not part of your program, but it can be used to help add comments to your code to remind you what certain things are doing. What I've used it for here is to describe a problem that we're going to solve, and this tutorial is going to guide us through the approaches that we can take to solving these types of problems. So, we've got a teacher as students do a test, and a score of 80 or more is a distinction, a score of 60 or more is a merit, and a score of 50 or more is a pass. Anything below 50 is classed as a fail. We've got to write a program that asks for a score and then outputs the correct grade. So, first thing that you ever have when you approach a problem like this is knowing where to begin. It's something that I call blank screen syndrome. You've got a problem, but you've got no idea how you're going to solve the problem in one big chunk. Well, what any good programmer will do is they'll take a problem and they'll start to break it down into smaller sequences, smaller steps. Solve those smaller steps and then build on them. Don't try and solve it all in one go. So, let's think about what we need to do. The last line here says write a program that asks for a score and then outputs the correct grade. So let's ignore the last part of that statement. Let's ignore the bit about outputting the correct grade for the moment. Let's focus on the first thing, which is to ask for a score. What we need to do is get the user to enter a score and then store it somewhere. Now that should be ringing a bell. We should be saying we've done something similar to that before. And if we have, we can go looking through our past programs, looking through our past tutorials, and finding a similar example. It might not be the solution to this problem, but we might have access to a similar solution, which will help us solve this one. So, we need to ask the user to enter a score. So, let's assume we need to create a variable. We need a place to store this score that the user is going to enter. So let's create a variable called score. And then we need to assign that a value. Now the value needs to be entered by the user. Hopefully we can recall from previous tutorials that there was a function called input which we could use to enter a number from the user. And then we can simply ask them to enter a score. Now remember, we need to use input. There was another function that did something similar called raw input. But in Python we use raw input for getting in text values, and we use input for getting in numbers. And score is a number, so we've got to use raw input. Now, let's just see if this has worked. Let's add a print command to just output whatever is in the score. So we've asked the user to input a score, we're storing that in this variable here, and then we're just going to print it to see if this bit works. And we haven't solved the whole problem yet. We're not printing distinction, merit, or pass, but hopefully we've solved part of the problem. So let's run it, enter a score. Let's say we're going to enter 80, click on OK, and although it hasn't output distinction, merit, or pass, at least we know we've got the number in. So we know we've solved part of the problem. Hopefully that will then build up our confidence. So the next thing we need to deal with then is probably this thing here. We need to output distinction if the score is 80 or more. So we need to make a decision, a choice. We need to compare score to a value. In this case, probably the value 80. How do we do this? Again, alarm bells should be ringing in our head. We should be saying we've done something similar to this before. We've used something before that has compared one value with another. It was the if statement from the previous two tutorials. So, if we introduce an if statement and we say if the score greater than 80, then we want to print distinction. Okay? So we're getting the score in from the user using the input function. We're then using the if command to see if the score is greater than 80. If it is, we then want it to print distinction. Let's see what happens if we hit the play button. We hit the play button, we enter a score. Let's say we enter the score 80. Click on OK, and it does nothing. Now, at this point, usually in class, this is the stage at which you'd probably start shouting out for sir or sticking your hand up. But a good programmer will start to look at the code first and try and solve the problem for themselves, or get a friend or colleague in the class to have a look to see if they can work out what might be wrong. But let's look at the logic. We've got a statement here that says if the score is greater than 80. Well, think about the number we just typed in. We typed in the number 80. So if we read this now using the number that we typed in, if 80 is greater than 80, print distinction. Think about that again. If 80 is greater than 80. Well, 80 is not greater than 80, is it? So it won't have done this line of code here, because it only does this if the condition is true. We can fix this simply though. Cast your mind back to one of the previous tutorials, and we said that you could do a greater than or equal to, less than or equal to. So all we need to do is add an equal sign into here, so that this statement now says if the score is greater than or equal to 80, then do this. So let's run it again. Let's put 80 in and see what it does. It outputs distinction, which is what we expected. If we play it, and we put in, say, 79 now, which is one less than you need for a distinction, and click on OK, it does nothing. So it looks like we've solved this task here. Again, remember, we're breaking it down. We're not trying to solve it all in one go. We're trying to solve it bit by bit. So we think we've solved this. So let's move on to the next problem here. A score of 60 or more is a merit. This should be a doddle, because all we need to do here is simply say if the score greater than equal to 60, then print merit. Okay, so let's run it. Let's put 80 in first. Distinction and merit. Don't think we can get both grades. So something's not quite right here. So how can we go about solving this? If you think about it, look at the logic again. If score greater than or equal to 60. Well, when we typed in 80, 80 was greater than or equal to 80. So it did distinction. It then went on and did this line of code here. And again, 80 is greater than or equal to 60. So it printed merit. Now that's not what we wanted. We only wanted to print merit if it was between 60 and 80. So, how can we go about solving that? Well, something we haven't yet told you about is that you can use an AND within an if statement. So, if score greater than or equal to 60 and score less than 80. So we're creating a slightly more complicated if statement here. We're saying if the score is greater than or equal to 60 and the score is less than 80. That's the range for the merit. So now let's run the program and see what we get. So let's type in 80 and hopefully we just get distinction. Doesn't necessarily prove that our program works yet. Let's Run it again. Let's put in 60. And hopefully this time we get merit. So, we're getting there. We now think we've solved this first stage here, the distinction. We now think we've solved this stage here, the merit. So the next thing we need to look at is this one here. A score of 50 or more rather, is a pass. So, we just now need to build on what we've got here. If the score greater than or equal to 50 and the score is less than 60, then we can print pass. Okay, so let's see what happens now. Let's run the program. Let's test it with 80. Should output distinction. Let's run it again. Output it with 60. Should output merit. Let's run it again. This time with 50, and it should output pass. I think we're almost done. The last thing we've got to consider is this thing here. Anything below 50 is a fail. Well, this should be a doddle now. All we need to do is add another if statement and say if the score is less than 50, then we want to print fail. So again, let's run the program, test all the combinations just to make sure that we haven't messed anything up by adding that extra line of code. Distinction, merit, pass, and then hopefully if we put 49 in, we should get fail. And we solved that problem. But again, notice we didn't try and solve it all in one go. We took it bit by bit. First problem that we solved was getting the number in from the user. Then we dealt with outputting whether they got a distinction or not. After fixing the problem, we got it to output whether they had a merit, then whether they had a pass, and finally if they had failed. The key lesson to learn here is that when you are presented with a problem, chances are you've done all the bits that you need to do in order to solve it. You've just got to work out what bits you've previously done and how you need to change them to mold them into the solution to the problem that's currently in front of you. And that concludes this tutorial.